In the latest turn of events in the Israel-Gaza conflict, hospitals in Gaza that Israeli airstrikes overnight into today have resulted in the deaths of at least 45 people, including multiple women and children and a 1-week-old infant, according to some reports. And in the West Bank, Israeli security forces have detained 20 people overnight, as reported by the Palestinian Prisoners Society. Pope Leo XIV has called for the immediate entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, describing the situation as more worrying and saddening. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
È sempre più preoccupante e dolorosa la situazione nella striscia di Gaza. Rinnovo il mio appello accorato a consentire l'ingresso di dignitosi aiuti umanitari e a porre fine alle ostilità, il cui prezzo straziante è pagato dai bambini, dagli anziani, dalle persone malate.
Italy has urged Israel to cease attacks on Gaza and open all crossings for aid. Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani called for a ceasefire, hostages release and an end to military operations affecting civilians. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas praised international opposition to Israel's blockade and starvation of Gaza after the EU ordered a review of its cooperation deal. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas confirmed the review, citing Gaza's catastrophic situation and the need to assess Israel's human rights record under the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Israel's foreign ministry rejected the EU's criticism, claiming it does not understand the complex reality Israel faces and could strengthen Hamas's position. The EU-Israel agreement, active since 2000, emphasises mutual respect for human rights and democracy. Dutch Foreign Minister Casper Veldkamp has called for a review, citing worsening humanitarian conditions in Israel. However, the European Union members are divided, with the Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky suggesting direct dialogue with Israel, while Hungary has blocked EU sanctions on violent Israeli settlers. Meanwhile, in the UK, the government announced it is suspending trade talks with Israel and summoning its ambassador over irrigatious policies in Gaza and the West Bank. And lastly, the United Nations continues to face challenges in delivering aid to Gaza. Israeli authorities require aid to be offloaded and inspected before entering, and the UN states that at least 500 aid trucks are needed daily to address the humanitarian crisis. We're now joined by Ross Feingold, political risk analyst located in Taipei, Taiwan, to discuss this in further detail. Ross, thank you very, very much for joining us on the programme. We're now seeing countries that Israel called allies respond to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Why now is Israel responding? This humanitarian crisis has been well documented. We've all seen it on social media. Why are world leaders, particularly in Europe, responding to this crisis right now?
Israel typically is happy with criticism that comes from Western Europe, but it typically does not change Israel's actions. However, the difference in recent hours is we have actual action from the United Kingdom suspending free trade talks, and we have discussion in the European Union about their cooperation agreement with Israel and whether Israel is adhering to the human rights clause of that agreement. So now that the Europeans are actually getting up to substantive action as opposed to just verbal criticism, I think Israel is sensitive to that. We do see a response. Israel has indicated it's willing to let in more aid trucks, although that process has been slow and the UN says it hasn't really happened yet. But there is some movement in allowing in aid trucks. I think we have to see in the coming hours what actually happens and whether those trucks really are allowed in and are allowed to deliver aid to civilians.
Ross, we've obviously seen Western Europe impose sanctions, particularly the UK has imposed sanctions and suspended trade talks. Do you see these measures really making a difference in regard to the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Do you think Israel will look at these measures and think we need to act, or do you think they will see their military operation as more important?
I think it might be a combination. So again, I think Israel is sensitive to some of the criticism, and specifically when there's actual actions taken by the UK or the EU or EU member countries on a unilateral basis. I think Israel does respond to that. It doesn't change how they go about the fighting of the war, but it does cause some movement on allowing in the aid trucks and the distribution of aid. But no matter how many trucks are going to come into Gaza, one thing that Israel has to and will absolutely retain a final say-so over is the ability of those aid trucks to only distribute aid to civilians, and for Hamas not to be able to steal any of that aid. Israel is going to be very, very vigilant about that, and we have to see in the coming hours whether that causes more disagreements between the EU countries and Israel.
Ross, what can we think of the future of this war? Obviously, we've seen it going on for months now. The humanitarian situation is very well documented on social media and other media outlets, as we've previously talked about. But how close, how do you think history is going to look back on this war? I know that's a difficult question, but this is how many people have been phrasing it. The UK have said it's despicable. You've got Spain's Prime Minister, who's been very, very vocal about the humanitarian situation in particular, still continuing to condemn Hamas, but they seem to believe that this retaliation to the October the 7th is unjustified now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think what we may see is there is one option for European countries to take, which only a small number have taken up to now, and other countries have been more deferential to Israel and not made the decision. And that's the recognition of an independent Palestinian state. So we see some talk among European countries that haven't recognized Palestine as an independent state. Their past policy was always to wait until the Israelis and the Palestinians have reached an agreement and then recognize Palestine. But we see some movement and some talk in Europe about more countries recognizing Palestine immediately. This will make Israel very, very upset with the European countries, but it does seem to be an action that more European countries above the few that have already done so, they might take that action now to show their displeasure with Israel.
Ross, we've obviously seen the start of Operation Gideon's Chariots with countless civilians and reported civilian casualties on a daily basis. We've also seen Netanyahu withdraw his officials from Doha in these ceasefire talks. Do you see this deal going forward? And in regards to the US involvement even, Donald Trump pledged that this war would be over during his campaign. How would you assess the situation in the Middle East now to this time at the start of Donald Trump's presidency?
Ceasefire talks have been on and off since the beginning of hostilities in October 2023. Every time we think that they're done talking, they seem to make a movement to talk again. So we really shouldn't discount the possibility that ceasefire talks with the intervention of the mediators like Qatar or even the United States, maybe Egypt. It's worked before, so it may still work again. There was also an agreement between the UAE and Israel to allow in aid trucks. So the UAE being an Arab country that does have diplomatic relations with Israel, they still have that ability to serve in that kind of mediation, direct discussion with Israel and prompt some movement kind of role. So I wouldn't eliminate the possibility of Arab countries still working with Israel to bring about more aid or even a ceasefire. I think these things are all on the table despite the rhetoric we might see or hear day to day from the stakeholders.
Ross Feingold, thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have your insight. We now